Will you talk about your history with Theranos? I think you alluded to this in a tweet.
Yeah. So in 2006, I was working in Palo Alto at a consulting firm, and a good friend of mine, he had a connection to Theranos. And at the time, both he and I were considering jobs there. He in the role of chief financial officer and me in the role of chief medical officer. This was very early days. I don't recall what year Theranos was founded. I want to say 2003, but it was still very small. And I remember their office was next to ours. I think we were actually both on California Avenue in Palo Alto. So the first time I went over there to meet with Elizabeth Holmes, I remember it was just a tiny place. I think there were maybe 20 or 30 employees, and we sat down and looked at this black box that they had and talked about a bunch of things that had to do with the business and the technology. And we met again. And ultimately I decided not to take the job for several reasons. One of the reasons was when I did my due diligence on their investors, something came up on one of the investors that someone I knew and trusted a lot didn't have a lot of great things to say about one of their investors. And, when you're thinking about joining a startup company, that kind of stuff matters. The other thing is I really loved what I was actually doing. So the hurdle rate for me to kind of leave what I was doing had to be very high because I was super happy at McKinsey and really, really loving the work I was doing. And then the third thing was I wasn't convinced that what you could test in a box that size was interesting. So although Elizabeth was incredibly secretive about what they were doing, and I was not allowed to look in the box, which of course and I'm sure every other person that showed up would ask that question. Okay, let's actually see what's in the box. That was a no-go, even under an NDA.
If people want a primer on Theranos, there's a documentary right on HBO if they don't know the story behind it.
That's right. Yeah. Nothing I'm saying now will be even remotely interesting if you don't understand why in the end, this is an interesting story. But I knew enough about diagnostics and I knew enough about the chemistry of it that I knew that there was pretty much not going to be anything you could do on a drop of blood in a box that size that was clinically interesting. And so in the end, the reason I did not go forward was I just didn't think it was medically interesting enough. I thought, look, yeah, you'll figure out a way to do a Chem 20 and a CBC and a few other things, but I don't care. That's not, you're not moving the needle in terms of clinical medicine. So that was the end of that. So that was 2006. Now fast forward to 2014. So it's 8 years later. Elizabeth is on the cover of Forbes. The most recent valuation of Theranos is $9 billion. And I remember coming home and saying to my wife, I was like, do you remember that company I almost joined 8 years ago? And she didn't remember. And I told her the whole story. And she's like, oh, yeah. And I said, this is how much money we'd be worth today if I had taken that job, based on my estimation of how much dilution would have occurred in the cap table, et cetera, et cetera. And it was a big number. And it was like a life-changing number. And she was just like, oh, wow. You win some, you lose some, huh? I was like, yeah. So I kind of never really thought about it again. And then fast forward to the beginning of October 2015, there's an event in San Francisco called the Vanity Fair something or other. I don't remember it's like a Vanity Fair event. And this was back in the day when a lot of my life revolved around fundraising and, I don't know, just having to be at events like this. So I was at this event and Elizabeth was the main attraction of the event, actually. So much so that Mark Zuckerberg also spoke, but he was at one of the smaller breakouts. So Elizabeth was really the main attraction. And the night either of or before her big talk, there was a cocktail party. And I actually wasn't invited to the cocktail party because it was really only for the important people. But I was there with Tim Ferriss, and he was invited to it. So I got to be Tim's date. So Tim and I went to the cocktail party together. And we're just sort of playing patty cakes, and in walks Elizabeth. And of course she's just swarmed by people. But somehow over the course of the next 20 or 30 minutes, she ends up standing kind of right next to me. And I'm thinking to myself, there's no way she's going to remember me. Because of course, by this point it's been 9 years. But anyway, I said to her, hey, Elizabeth, you're probably not going to remember me, but we met, and she goes, oh, no, I remember you. Your name's Peter. She didn't remember my last name, but I barely remember my last name. So she's like, yeah, your name's Peter. And we met in 2006 and you're a friend of so-and-so who was the person. And she literally knew everything. I was really, really surprised. And I said, Elizabeth, that's unfreaking believable. How could you possibly remember that? And she's like, oh, no, I totally remember, and blah, blah, blah. And I was like, hey, well, congratulations on all of your success. I mean, it's just amazing. And she's like, she gave me her card and she's like, look, let's stay in touch. I'd love to talk with you again, blah, 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 blah. So this was the first week of October in 2015. And I think it was I want to say that was a Thursday night. I think it was a couple days later, early in the next week, when the John Carreyrou story in the Wall Street Journal hit. It's just hard in retrospect now. Of course, you realize that all of that stuff had been brewing long before. And obviously Elizabeth knew this was coming. And, I got to say, I think you don't come away from that documentary with a lot of empathy for Elizabeth. I don't think that's the purpose of the documentary at all. But in retrospect, if you're going to try to just, if do nothing else, but practice the art of having empathy for people who you don't think deserve any, it's hard for me to imagine the cognitive dissonance she would have been experiencing when on the one hand, she is at this event, which is a huge event, by the way. I mean, the sort of people who were there, I mean, it was the who's who of everything, right? I mean, I remember walking out of one of the sessions and literally almost bumping into Bradley Cooper, who, by the way, is incredibly good looking. It's worth pointing this out, by the way, in real life, how good looking Bradley Cooper is. I just want to state that for the record. It's almost upsetting how good looking he is, because you sort of think wait, I mean, a person's not supposed to be that good looking. But anyway, and here she was as the headliner of this event. And yet in her mind, she has to know her world is about to get really messy. Now, the flip side of that from a psychology standpoint is I don't believe that Elizabeth ever thought she was doing anything wrong. I am fundamental, which is not for a moment to say she shouldn't be held accountable for what happened. I think you can be so delusional that you can truly, I don't think Hitler believed he was doing anything wrong either. So the fact that you don't believe you're doing something wrong doesn't in any way absolve you of the responsibility of what you've done. But it's a very important distinction, I think, which is you are so delusional that you really believe that the lies you're telling are for the better good. And therefore, I think Elizabeth felt that, this was just a temporary speed bump along the way. But anyway, it's sort of interesting. We stayed in touch over email a couple of times in the ensuing months, and then obviously, lost track. But that's my little history of almost having gone to work at Theranos.
I think another thing that I thought about with that, watching the documentary, is when you watch the documentary, you think, how can these people, the people that were on board, how could these people be so foolish and be duped and everything? I think hindsight bias really plays a role there, that after the fact, when everybody's looking at where all the chips have fallen, that people think.
And to be clear, I want to make sure that nobody ever assumes I'm trying to take credit for knowing the whole thing was a fraud. That I never suspected. So not for a second did that ever cross my mind, either at the time or in the years that followed. I just thought it was the world's most uninteresting business in the history of civilization. Point of care testing in a drugstore for Chem 7 and CBC. I mean, I would have more interest in a business that specialized in removing hangnails and nose hairs. That to me is more interesting than just being able to get a CBC and Chem 7 at Rite Aid. So my opposition to it was, I never suspected there was fraud going on.
Yeah.
But,
And opportunity costs. It sounded like you had a good gig going too.
Yeah. I mean, in the end, it's our paths are our paths.